year was 1014. The air smelled of smoke, salt, and blood. From the wind-swept shores of Northumbria to the green farmlands of Wessex, the land groaned under a shadow it could not escape. The Viking longships had returned, sleek wooden beasts, with dragon heads carved into their bows, sliding silently across the waves like omens of death. And behind them came fire. Across the countryside, villages burned. Families who had worked the soil for generations now fled with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Smoke curled into the heavens like dark prayers, while the sound of screams carried on the wind. To many, it seemed as though the very land of England had been abandoned by God. It was in this climate of despair that Archbishop Wulfstan of York rose to his pulpit, on a cold winter's day, in the heart of a crumbling kingdom. He stood before his congregation and spoke words that would echo through history. Nothing has prospered now for a long time either at home or abroad. There has been military devastation, and hunger, burning, and bloodshed in nearly every district, time and again. The crowd shivered. His voice did not carry the calm comfort of a holy man. It struck like thunder, like prophecy. To his flock, Wulfstan was not merely describing their suffering. He was declaring their doom. For years, Viking armies had cut through England like a plague. The farmers could not harvest their crops without fear. The fishermen dared not go to sea lest a Viking sail appear on the horizon. Families locked their doors at night with prayers, but prayers could not stop steel. Every monastery, every village, every lonely road carried the same story. The land was bleeding, yet the people did not only fear the raiders, they feared their own king. Upon the throne of England sat Ethelred II, known to history by a name that was less a title and more a curse to unready. Though he had ruled for decades, his kingdom had only grown weaker, more fractured, more vulnerable. In the shadows of fire and famine, rumors grew. Some whispered that the crown itself was cursed, poisoned by the blood spilled years before, when Ethelred's half-brother Edward the Martyr was mysteriously slain, paving the way for the boy king's rise. Others believed Wulfstan's words, that God himself had turned his face away from England, punishing its people for sins unspoken. Whatever the truth, the reality was clear. The king was powerless, and the land was dying. Imagine it, a winter night in 1014. The snow falling gently over a ruined village in Essex. A mother huddles with her children inside the charred remains of their home, listening to the distant echo of laughter from Viking camps across the river. In the morning, she knows, the raiders will come again. Not for gold, they have already taken it. Not for silver, there is little left to steal. They will come for slaves, for flesh, for the sheer joy of terror. And where was their king? Hidden in the safety of London's stone walls, surrounded by whispers of betrayal and fear. The sermon of Archbishop Wulfstan cut deeper than a sword. He spoke of a kingdom drowning in its own sins, of leaders who had turned away from duty, of a ruler who had failed his people. He called upon England to repent, but behind his holy words lay something darker, a recognition that repentance might not save them, that perhaps the curse had already settled and nothing could lift it. To the common folk, these words felt like prophecy. Every burning village confirmed it. Every starving child made it real. Each time the Vikings returned, the prophecy seemed fulfilled. England was not simply being invaded, it was being judged. The chronicles of the time described the land as if it were a living thing, collapsing under its own weight. Fields went untended, markets fell silent. Entire towns emptied overnight, their people fleeing into forests or across the sea. Wolves crept back into abandoned villages, howling through the empty streets. The kingdom that had once stood proud under Alfred the Great now seemed a ghost of itself, and still the fires burned. By the end of that year, 1014, the English people found themselves staring into the abyss. Their world was breaking, and their leaders seemed unable or unwilling to stop it. Archbishop Wulfstan's sermon was not just a warning, it was a eulogy for a nation that was still alive, yet already dying. As his words echoed through the churches of England, they planted a thought in the minds of every man, woman, and child. Perhaps we are cursed. Perhaps our king has doomed us. Perhaps there is no escape. This was the beginning of the end. The burning of England had only just begun. The year was 978. The kingdom of England trembled with whispers, for blood had been spilled at the very heart of the royal family. In a lonely courtyard at Corfe Castle, a young king had fallen betrayed, it was said, by those closest to him. His name was Edward the Martyr, a boy barely in his teens, struck down as he paused to drink from a cup of wine. The chronicles are unclear about who lifted the blade, but one truth remained. The death cleared the path for another child to rise. His name was Ethelred, son of King Edgar and Queen Elthryth. He was no more than 12 years old, and from the very moment the crown touched his head, the people whispered that it was cursed. Edward's death was not just a murder, it was a rupture in the kingdom's soul. Some called him a saint, a martyr, whose blood had been shed unjustly. His followers believed England would suffer until the crime was avenged. Others whispered darker tales, that Edward had been struck down by orders from within the royal court, perhaps even by Ethel's own mother, who sought the throne for her son. Whether true or not, the rumor clung to the boy like a shadow. Every decision he made, every failure that followed, was judged not as the mistakes of a child king, but as the punishment for a crime he may never have committed. Imagine the scene of his coronation. A boy stands in the great hall of Kingston, upon Thames, his small frame swallowed by robes of kingship. The weight of the crown is heavier than his neck can bear. Around him, the nobles murmur their oaths. But their eyes do not rest on him. They glance at each other, calculating, scheming, wondering how a child could rule a kingdom already under threat. Outside, the people watch with unease. They had seen one boy king die under suspicious hands. Now another rises in his place. Was this destiny, or a curse unfolding step by step? Ethelred's youth became his greatest weakness. Where Alfred the Great had commanded warriors, and Edgar the Peaceful had kept order across the realm, Ethelred relied on advisors, men whose loyalty was often paper-thin. He had not earned their respect, nor could he control them. The Witan, the Council of Nobles, became a nest of vipers, each whispering in the king's ear, each pulling him in a different direction. History would give him the name Unready, not because he was lazy or unwilling, but because he was ill. The old English word unread meant bad counsel, and from the very start his rule was poisoned by it. But for the people of England, the truth mattered little. They did not see a boy king struggling under the weight of scheming nobles. They saw the ghost of Edward the Martyr. They remembered the blood spilled at Corfe Castle. Every raid, every famine, every betrayal that followed seemed like the price for that crime to the common folk. Ethelred's reign was not merely unlucky. It was divine retribution. There is a chilling image in the chronicles. Edward's body, dragged from his horse, his wounds bleeding into the earth. His followers buried him in secret, fearing the wrath of those who had ordered his death. Yet, miracles were later reported at his grave. Blind men claimed sight was restored. The sick claimed healing. Soon, Edward was declared a saint. And what did that mean for his half-brother Ethelred? It meant that the boy who wore the crown was forever haunted by the memory of the murdered child saint. His kingship was born in sin, and sin demands payment. As Ethelred grew, the world around him grew darker. The Viking sails began to appear once more along the coasts, and each invasion seemed fiercer than the last. But even before the great fleets came, his kingdom was already trembling from within. The boy who had been crowned in hope became the man remembered for despair. His childhood was swallowed by suspicion, his crown by guilt. Picture him years later, sitting in the royal hall as reports of new Viking raids pour in. His advisors argue, shouting over one another, each promising salvation, but serving their own greed. The king sits in silence, his eyes distant. Does he see the burning villages in his mind, or does he see his half-brother's face, pale and bloodied in the courtyard of Corfe Castle? The story of Ethelred's youth is not one of innocence. It is one of shadows, of a boy thrust into power before his time, burdened by the sins of others. His reign would be long, but from the very first day, it was marked by the whisper of doom, the king who should never have been. The child crowned, too soon. The chronicles call him Ethelred, the unready. But what does that truly mean? To the modern ear, it sounds like mockery, a king who was unprepared, unwilling, or simply too weak to rule. But in the language of the time, the word was different. In Old English, unread meant poorly advised. Not a king without readiness, but a king surrounded by whispers, poisoned by bad counsel. And yet, the truth was darker. For a ruler who cannot see through betrayal, who cannot rise above manipulation, is just as dangerous as the betrayers themselves. From the very start, Ethelred was a king in name but not in power. His court was a battlefield of voices. Powerful nobles tugged him in every direction, each claiming to act in England's best interest, while secretly plotting their own gain. The Boy King. It began with the sound of the sea. On a quiet morning, fishermen along the English coast would spot shapes on the horizon, dark silhouettes rising from the mist. At first, they looked like the wings of seabirds. But then, as the tide carried them closer, the truth became clear. Viking longships, their dragon-headed prows glared across the waves, sunlight glinting off polished wood and steel. Oars dipped in perfect rhythm, propelling the sleek beasts forward with terrifying speed. To see one ship was dread enough. To see a dozen, 50, an entire fleet stretched across the water, was to feel the weight of doom. The longships were not armies of occupation. They were storms. They came without warning, struck with brutal precision, and vanished back to the sea before the king's messengers could even reach London. And with each raid, England bled a little more. The Vikings of Ethelred's time were not the same men who had once raided monasteries for quick plunder. These were seasoned warlords, descendants of those raiders, now hungering not just for silver, but for domination. They knew England's weaknesses. They knew its king was hesitant, its nobles divided, and they knew its coasts were rich with undefended villages, so they struck without mercy. Imagine the terror of their arrival. A bell tolls frantically in a small seaside church. Farmers drop their tools and flee inland, clutching their children. Smoke rises as huts are set alight. Women scream as warriors drag them away in chains. The old and weak are cut down where they stand, and the Vikings do not linger. They vanish as quickly as they came, leaving behind only ash, corpses, and silence. The survivors whisper that the dragon-headed ships are demons, sent as punishment for the sins of the land, and in their minds, the words of Archbishop Wulfstan return again and again, burning and bloodshed in nearly every district, time and again. For Ethelred, each raid was both a humiliation and a warning. He could not stop them. His armies were too slow, his navy too small, his nobles too disloyal. By the time his messengers carried word to his court, the Vikings were already gone, their sails lost to the horizon. The people began to ask themselves, was this truly war, or was it judgment? But the Vikings were not merely raiders. They were strategists. They knew that fear could break a kingdom faster than swords. By striking again and again, by leaving no village safe, they turned England into a land of paranoia. Merchants abandoned the seas. Farmers feared to sow their crops. Priests warned their congregations that the end of days was near. It was not just the land they sought to conquer, it was the spirit of its people. In the royal court, the reports piled up. Northumbria burned, Kent plundered, Essex raided again. Every corner of the kingdom was touched by the shadow of the Vikings. The king's advisors argued endlessly: should England pay them to leave? Should they gather armies for a decisive stand? Should they build new fortifications? But while they debated, the dragon ships kept coming, and with each raid, the legend of Viking cruelty grew. They were said to laugh as they set villages aflame, to carve runes of victory into the walls of churches, to mock the prayers of monks before cutting them down. Whether all the tales were true mattered little. Fear magnified them. The very name of the Vikings became a weapon sharper than any axe. Ethelred's people looked to him for protection, but what they saw was a king paralyzed, a king who could not anticipate where the next blow would fall. To the people, it was as though the king's hesitation summoned the very fleets that haunted their shores. The shadow of the Vikings was not just physical, it was psychological. It darkened every thought, every dream, every hope, and yet, hidden within this terror was a truth few dared speak aloud. The Vikings did not come only because they were strong. They came because England was weak. The nobles were divided, each guarding their own lands, reluctant to unite under a king they did not trust. Spies whispered of traitors who secretly welcomed the invaders, hoping to gain power in the chaos. The kingdom was a house already cracked, and the Vikings were the storm that widened the fractured. Picture England at night, the horizon glowing faintly from a distant fire. Families huddled together in silence, listening for the sound of oars on the river, the creak of wood, the war horns that announce slaughter. Every night they asked themselves the same question: will it be us next? For Ethelred, the Vikings were more than an enemy. They were a mirror, reflecting back all his failures. His court saw it, his people felt it, and in time, even he must have known it. The shadow of the Vikings was not just cast across England's coasts. It stretched across Ethelred's soul, and it would never leave him. The year was 991. The sea carried with it not only the crash of waves, but the sound of war horns. On the shores of Malden, Viking warriors clashed with English defenders in a brutal battle. Blood stained the earth, and the English fell in heaps beneath the axes of their enemies. When the smoke cleared, the survivors brought grim news to the king. England could not win. Ethelred sat in his royal hall, his face pale as reports poured in. The Vikings were too many, too fierce, too relentless. His nobles argued endlessly, but one grim solution rose above the noise: if they cannot be defeated, they must be paid. And so began one of the darkest policies in English history, the tribute, known as Danegeld, in the Great Treasury. Silver was gathered, coins minted with the king's seal, wealth drawn from the sweat of farmers and the labor of craftsmen. Wagon after wagon was filled, until 10,000 pounds of silver lay ready, an unimaginable fortune. Messengers carried it to the Viking camps. There, in the flickering light of their fires, the warlords smiled. Peace had been purchased. But at what cost? The first payment bought silence for a season. Villages rebuilt, fields were sown, and weary people breathed a fragile sigh of relief. Yet beneath the surface, dread lingered. For silver cannot quench hunger, it only feeds it. The Vikings took their treasure, sailed away, and returned again the following year. Their demand was larger this time, and again the king complied. Imagine the bitterness of the common folk. A farmer sees his last coins taken by tax collectors, knowing they will not repair roads or build defenses, but instead be handed to the very men who burned his fields. A mother watches her children go hungry so that ships full of silver can sail into the enemy's hands. To the people, it felt as if their king was not protecting them, but betraying them. The policy of Danegeld grew into a cycle of despair. The Vikings arrived. Ethelred paid them to leave. They returned, emboldened. More silver was demanded. More blood was spilled. It was like feeding a wolf in hopes it would become tame, only to find it waiting at the door each night, hungrier than before. The chronicles record staggering sums, tens of thousands of pounds of silver poured into Viking hands over the years. England's treasury bled dry, taxes rose, resentment festered. And yet, each time Ethelred reached for the coin rather than the sword. Why? Perhaps he feared the battlefield. Perhaps he no longer trusted his own nobles to fight. Or perhaps, deep within, he believed Archbishop Wulfstan's warning that England was cursed, and no army could break the judgment of God. But paying for peace carried its own curse. For the Vikings were not simply thieves. They were opportunists. Each payment told them the same truth. England was weak, and weakness invites predators. Picture the scene in a Viking camp. Warlords counting English silver by torchlight, laughing as the coins spill through their fingers. They speak of England not as a kingdom, but as a harvest. A land not to be conquered, but to be milked season after season, raid after raid. The tribute that was meant to protect England instead painted a target upon it. Among Ethelred's people, anger boiled. Some cursed their king as a coward, unworthy of the crown he wore. Others whispered darker accusations that perhaps he and his court grew rich by striking secret bargains with the invaders. Whether true or not, the silver bought only distrust. And what of the king himself? Did Ethelred see the despair in his people's eyes? Did he hear their whispers? Or did he bury his shame beneath the weight of his crown, convincing himself that survival even through tribute was better than annihilation? The chronicles do not tell us his heart. They only tell us the result. A kingdom drained of wealth, weakened in spirit, and no closer to peace. The silver bought time, but time is not salvation. And with each coin handed to the enemy, the prophecy of doom grew stronger. By the turn of the century, England had paid so much Danegeld that its economy itself began to warp. Silver that could have built armies, fortified walls, or fed the poor instead, filled the coffers of the very men who returned with sharper swords and larger fleets. It was not just tribute. It was the slow bleeding of a nation. The policy would outlive Ethelred, echoing into legend as a warning. Once you pay the Danegeld, you never get rid of the Dane. And though centuries have passed, the lesson remains. England's silver bought no peace. It only bought the shadow of the next raid. The year was drawing toward its darkest hour. England was still standing, but it was no longer united. Inside the royal court of Ethelred, fear walked louder than footsteps. Shadows lingered behind every curtain. Whispers carried further than the king's command, and worst of all, many began to wonder if the real danger came not from the sea, but from the halls of the palace itself. The Viking raids had torn holes in the kingdom, but betrayal was tearing holes in its soul. Nobles, bishops, earls all had their own loyalties, their own ambi. The year was 1013. England bled from 1,000 wounds. Villages smoldered. Monasteries, once rich with books and gold, lay in ashes. And yet, the greatest danger did not come from Viking ships cutting through the rivers. It came from within. The cracks in the kingdom were no longer hidden. They were wide and visible, like the gaping wounds left after a raid. Ethelred's lords, men sworn to defend the crown, whispered in smoky halls, their loyalty shifting with the winds of fortune. Oaths of service were now measured in silver, and the Vikings, with their endless hunger for gold, always had more to offer. Inside the royal court of Winchester, betrayal became an unspoken game. Men smiled at the king during feasts, raising goblets in false loyalty, while secretly arranging deals in the shadows. Ethelred watched it unfold, powerless. He had neither the iron hand to crush their treachery, nor the charisma to win them back every day. The crown slipped further from his grasp. The Vikings understood this weakness. They didn't need to fight long, bloody battles. They let greed rot England from within. When their fleets arrived, many English lords simply stood aside, allowing the enemy to march through villages unopposed. To the common people, It felt like betrayal layered upon betrayal. They had no walls to retreat behind, no treasure to bribe. The invaders. They saw only their homes burning and their children fleeing into the forests. And still, their own lords remained silent, trading their people's lives for safety and wealth. Archbishop Wulfstan's voice rang out again from the pulpit. Sharper now, like thunder rolling over a doomed land. He cried, "A nation divided cannot stand. When brother turns against brother, the sword of the enemy is but a shadow." But his warnings fell on deaf ears. Ethelred grew suspicious of everyone around him. He dismissed loyal servants and punished those he thought disloyal, even without proof. Yet in this paranoia, he made himself more alone. The king who once had an army at his command now found himself surrounded by men whose daggers were hidden but ready. This was the true curse of his reign, not only the terror of the Northmen, but the quiet treachery of his own household. The people began to murmur that God had abandoned England. Every defeat seemed like divine judgment. Every betrayal, a sign that heaven had turned its face away. The kingdom of Alfred the Great, once united, strong, and proud, was dissolving into dust. The shadows within England grew darker than any storm at sea, and in the center of it all stood Ethelred, a man still called king, but king in name only. The year was 1013. Winter's winds swept across the land, but it was not the cold that chilled England's people. It was the sight of sails upon the horizon. Dozens upon dozens of dragon-prowed ships cut through the waves like silent predators. Their oars struck the water in unison, the rhythm of an invading heartbeat. Leading them was a name that carried terror wherever it was spoken: Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark. Hardened by decades of war and blood, he had come not merely to raid, but to conquer. For years, the English had paid silver to keep the Northmen away, but Sweyn no longer wanted bribes. He wanted the crown itself. And unlike Ethelred, he commanded loyalty through fear and respect. His men followed him without hesitation, their eyes fixed on the promise of plunder and glory. When Sweyn's army landed upon English shores, resistance melted like frost in the sun. The English lords, already divided, already weary of Ethelred's indecision, bent their knees to the Danish king. Some welcomed him openly, seeing in him a stronger ruler than their own. Town after town fell without a sword being raised. Villages opened their gates. Even London, the jewel of the kingdom, trembled at his approach. The Viking tide was unstoppable. And where was Ethelred? He fled. The King of England abandoned his throne, his people, and his crown. With his Queen Emma of Normandy and their children, he sailed across the sea, seeking refuge in the courts of Normandy. The throne of Alfred, once defended with blood and fire, now lay empty, claimed by a foreign conqueror. To the English people, it was a moment of despair unlike any they had ever known. Their king had run, and in his place stood a man whose language, customs, and gods were alien. They whispered that the prophecy of Archbishop Wulfstan had come true, that a kingdom divided from within would be swallowed from without. Yet, in the strange way that history often unfolds, this was not the end. Sweyn Forkbeard ruled only briefly, his iron hand gripping England for less than a year. His death came suddenly, some said by sickness, others whispered by divine judgment. Whatever the cause, his passing left a vacuum once more. England was not free, but it was not yet lost. Across the sea, in exile, Ethelred heard the news. The same lords who had betrayed him now called for his return, not because they loved him, but because the tide of war demanded a king of their own choosing. Ethelred returned, not as a triumphant ruler, but as a man dragged back by circumstance. His throne was waiting, but so were the shadows of betrayal, the unending threat of the Vikings, and the growing belief that England itself was cursed, for the tide had not yet receded. Another storm was coming, fiercer and darker than the last. The age of Ethelred was far from over, but so too was his. Doom. The year was 1015. The sea was restless once more, as if it remembered the thunder of Viking oars. And soon, England would remember too. For though Sweyn Forkbeard was gone, his son was not. Canute the Great, young, ruthless, and ambitious, had inherited his father's will to rule. Where his father had struck England, like lightning, would grind it down like the slow weight of a storm that never ended. This time, he came with an army vast enough to drown a kingdom. Danes, Norwegians, mercenaries, men who lived for silver, fire, and blood. They carried shields painted with snarling beasts, axes that had shattered skulls on 3 continents, and a hunger for conquest that no bribe could satisfy. When Canute's fleet appeared upon the horizon, there was no surprise, no hope, no illusions. The English had seen this story before, and yet Ethelred, the king who had fled, the king branded coward, the king cursed, still sat upon the throne. He returned from exile not with renewed strength, but with fear carved deep into his soul. His court was divided, his nobles uncertain, his people weary. The lords whispered, "Can he save us? Or worse, do we even want him to?" For years they had followed a king who did not fight, a king who did not lead, a king who bought peace with silver that only delayed the storm, and now the storm had returned. When Canute's armies marched inland, burning towns, slaughtering villagers, seizing fortresses, the English could barely muster resistance. Too many had already bent the knee. Convinced the future belonged to the Northmen, and in the royal halls Ethelred wavered. He fell ill, some said with a wasting sickness, others with the weight of despair. His eyes grew hollow, his hands trembled. The crown upon his head seemed heavier than the world itself. Then in April of the year 1016, the prophecy was fulfilled. Ethelred, son of Edgar, the peaceful, heir to Alfred's bloodline. The king who had fled and returned, breathed his last. England did not mourn him as it had once mourned heroes. The chronicles did not praise him. His death was written with cold finality, as if his reign had been a long, tragic mistake. Ethelred, the unready, was gone, and his people whispered that perhaps God himself had abandoned him. But the war did not end. His son, Edmund Ironside, rose in his place, a warrior of fierce spirit, the very opposite of his father. The land rallied behind him, for here at last was a king who would not flee, and so began one of the fiercest struggles in England's history, the war between Edmund Ironside and Canute the Great. Battle after battle shook the kingdom, Ashington, Shurston, Brentford. Edmund fought with a courage that lit hope like a flame in the hearts of the English. He was not unready. He was unbreakable. Yet, fate has its own design. In the end, after victories and defeats, triumph and despair, the war ended not with conquest alone, but with compromise. Edmund and Canute agreed to divide England, the north for the Dane, the south for the English king. It might have worked, but fate was cruel. Edmund Ironside died within months, some say of wounds, others of betrayal, still others whispered of poison. His death left no challenger strong enough to resist, and so, in the year 1016, England, the land of Alfred, of kings and saints, of prophecies and prayers, fell into the hands of Canute the Great. For the first time in its history, England was ruled not by its own blood, but by a conqueror from across the sea. The tide that had begun with Sweyn Forkbeard now ended with his son, and the throne of England became the prize of the North. And in the shadows of this tale, the memory of Ethelred lingered, a reminder of what happens when kings ignore the warnings of history. History is not kind. It remembers kings not always for what they tried, but for what they failed to do. And so it was with Ethelred, son of Edgar, the peaceful. In the chronicles of monks, in the sagas of Northmen, in the whispers of his own people, he is not remembered as a warrior, nor a builder, nor a savior. He is remembered by a single name, Ethelred, the unready. But what does that truly mean? The word did not mean foolish, as many believe today. In Old English, unrid meant bad counsel. Ethelred was not without intelligence. He was not without courage. But his reign was poisoned by hesitation, betrayal, and decisions that came too late. He listened to advisers who sold him lies. He trusted men who sold his kingdom to the enemy. He built